What makes a person snap? Is it a single, earth-shattering moment, or a slow, quiet erosion of the soul, like water dripping on a stone? We often imagine monsters as snarling beasts in the shadows, but sometimes, the most terrifying darkness is found hiding behind the brightest, most welcoming smile. The story you are about to hear is a chilling testament to how the deepest secrets can be hidden in plain sight, even served on a silver platter for all to enjoy. It's a story about the perfect wife, the perfect life, and the perfect revenge. Before we dive into the disturbing disappearance of Arthur Vance and the dark culinary masterpiece of his wife, Eleanor, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button below. Make sure you also ring the notification bell, so you never miss another journey into the shadows where domesticity and depravity collide. You won't want to be late for this meal. The Vance residence was a monument to manufactured perfection. Located on the oak-lined serenity of Maple Crest Lane, the two-story colonial-style house was the envy of the neighborhood. Its lawn was a carpet of impossible green, the flower beds a curated explosion of seasonal color, and the windows so immaculately clean they seemed like vacant eyes staring into a world that could never be as orderly as the life within. This order was the sole domain of Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, at 42, was as meticulously maintained as her home. Her blonde hair was always swept into a graceful chignon. Her clothes were tasteful and impeccably pressed, and her hands, though constantly busy, were always manicured. She moved through her home with a silent, purposeful grace, a choreographer of domestic tranquility. Her stage, her sanctuary, her entire world was the kitchen. It was a chef's dream, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and white marble that Eleanor had designed herself. The 6-burner Wolf range was her altar, the Sub-Zero refrigerator her tabernacle. On the custom-built butcher block island, a formidable array of German steel knives stood at attention in a magnetic block, their edges honed to a razor's sharpness. Eleanor knew each knife by weight, by balance, by the sound it made slicing through a tomato versus a dense cut of beef. Her kitchen was a laboratory of precision, and she was its master scientist. Her husband, Arthur Vance, was the beneficiary of this precision, though he seldom acknowledged it. Arthur was a man who had been built by ambition and polished by success. As a senior partner at a prestigious downtown investment firm, he was charismatic, commanding, and possessed a smile that could disarm a boardroom and charm a skeptic. He was handsome in a way that seemed expensive, from his tailored suits to his perfectly coiffed silver-streaked hair. To the outside world, he and Eleanor were the perfect couple, the high-powered husband and the devoted, domestic goddess who orchestrated their flawless life behind the scenes. But behind the closed doors of Maple Crest Lane, the air was different. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, laden with unspoken words and resentments that had been simmering for 2 decades. Arthur's charm was a currency he spent publicly, but at home he was often bankrupt of it. He saw Eleanor's world not as a contribution, but as a given. Her elaborate meals, the spotless home, her entire existence was simply the backdrop against which his important life unfolded. "Another chicken dish, Elle?" he might say, poking at a perfectly roasted poulet de Bresse she had spent hours preparing. He wouldn't look up from his phone, his thumb scrolling through market reports. "It's nice." Nice was Arthur's favorite word for her efforts. It was a verbal pat on the head, a word that simultaneously acknowledged and dismissed. It was the word he used for the coq au vin that took her 2 days to make, for the hand-rolled pasta, for the 7-layer chocolate torte she baked for his birthday. Her passion, her art, was merely a nice hobby. The tension had been escalating for years, a low-frequency hum of discontent. It began with small things. He would forget to mention he was bringing clients home for dinner, leaving Eleanor scrambling to conjure a 5-star meal out of thin air, a feat she always resentfully accomplished. He controlled their finances with an iron fist, giving her an allowance as if she were a child, every penny of which she had to justify. He'd mock her interest in culinary magazines. "Reading your little picture books again, dear? Find a new recipe for pot roast." Eleanor absorbed these cuts without comment. Her face would remain a placid mask of serene acceptance, but inside, Each barb, each casual dismissal, was catalogued and filed away. Her response was not to argue, but to retreat deeper into her kitchen. It was the one place where she had absolute control. Here, she was not just Arthur's wife. She was a creator, a destroyer. She could take the toughest, most resilient cuts of meat and, with time and technique, break them down until they were meltingly tender. She understood the chemistry of marinades, the transformative power of a slow braise. She learned to butcher. It started with whole chickens, then turkeys. She ordered books, watched hours of online tutorials. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she learned the lines of the body, the way muscle connected to bone. She bought a set of boning knives, a meat cleaver, and a small, precise handsaw. Arthur had laughed when he saw the new equipment. "My God, Eleanor, are you planning on opening a deli in here? A bit morbid, don't you think?" He chuckled, shaking his head as he loosened his tie after a long day. "I just want to understand the ingredients from their source," she had replied, her voice even, her eyes fixed on the diagram of a pig's anatomy. It's the only way to truly respect the food. He didn't understand. He didn't see the fierce, simmering intelligence behind her eyes. He saw a bored housewife with a new toy. He was oblivious to the fact that while he was mastering the art of the hostile takeover in the boardroom, she was mastering the art of deconstruction in the kitchen. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in late October. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the maple trees outside had turned a fiery, defiant red. Eleanor was in the midst of preparing for the firm's annual luncheon, an event she had catered for the past 10 years. It was her one public triumph, a day when Arthur's colleagues would lavish praise on her food, and for a few hours, she would feel seen. She was perfecting a new recipe for a complex, slow-cooked pork shoulder stew, one that involved a secret blend of over 20 spices and a 3-day marination process. The kitchen was filled with the warm, exotic scent of star anise, fennel, and smoked paprika. Arthur came home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and a perfume that Eleanor did not own. He dropped his briefcase by the door with a thud that echoed the final, dull beat of their marriage. He walked into the kitchen, his face a mask of weary impatience. "Eleanor, we need to talk," he said, bypassing a kiss on the cheek for the first time in 20 years. She didn't turn from the stove, where she was carefully searing a large cut of meat. The hiss of the fat hitting the hot cast iron pan was loud in the sudden silence. "Dinner is almost ready, Arthur. It's the new pork recipe you wanted to try." "I'm not hungry," he said. He leaned against the marble island, crossing his arms. The posture was one of finality. "I'm leaving you, Eleanor." The sizzle from the pan seemed to grow louder, filling her ears. She carefully turned the meat with a pair of long-handled tongs, ensuring the crust was a perfect, even mahogany. Her movements were steady, economical, not a single tremor in her hand. "I see," she said, her voice a low, calm murmur. He seemed taken aback by her lack of hysteria. He had rehearsed this moment, prepared for tears, for shouting, for pleading. Her placid composure unnerved him, and it made him cruel. "I've met someone," he continued, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "Her name is Tiffany. She's full of life, Eleanor. We have conversations. She understands my world. She isn't just here. The word hung in the air, thick and greasy as the smoke from the pan. She was just a part of the house, a fixture, like the grandfather clock in the hall or the expensive art on the walls. "And what about this?" Eleanor finally turned, gesturing with the tongs to the house, to the kitchen, to the life she had poured herself into. "Our life. Don't be dramatic. You'll be taken care of course," he said dismissively. "The house will be sold. You'll get your share, enough to get a small condo somewhere. You can, I don't know, keep up with your hobbies." He glanced at the stove with a contemptuous sneer. "Maybe open that little pot roast diner you've always dreamed of." That was the moment. It wasn't the affair, the lie, or the end of their marriage. It was the final, crushing dismissal of her life's only passion. The way he said pot roast diner, dripping with condescension, as if her entire world of complex flavors and techniques could be reduced to a single lumpen dish. He had taken her art and trampled it under his expensive Italian shoes. A strange and terrifying calm washed over Eleanor. It was a clarity so profound it felt like an awakening. The hum of resentment that had been the soundtrack to her life for years suddenly stopped. In its place was a pristine, crystalline silence. She really looked at him for the first time in a long time. She saw not the handsome, powerful man the world saw, but a collection of parts. The arrogant set of his jaw, the soft, fleshy part of his neck above his starched collar, the thick, meaty hands that had never once helped her carry the groceries. "Sit down, Arthur," she said, her voice so devoid of emotion it was almost a whisper. "You look tired. Let me get you a drink. And a little something to eat. You need to keep your strength up." His arrogance mistook her calm for defeat. He smirked, relieved. This would be easier than he thought. "Fine," he said, sinking into one of the bar stools at the island. "A whiskey. Neat." Eleanor moved to the liquor cabinet. Her hands were perfectly steady as she poured a generous measure of his favorite 21-year-old single malt. Then she opened the refrigerator. Tucked in the back was a small container of her special pâté, made from chicken livers and an assortment of earthy mushrooms. She spooned a dollop onto a delicate cracker. She carried the glass and the cracker to him, placing them gently on the marble countertop in front of him. "Here you are," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. He took a large swallow of the whiskey, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He picked up the cracker. "You know," he said, his mouth full, "Tiffany is a terrible cook, absolutely hopeless in the kitchen. It's actually quite charming." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that filled the sterile room. "It will be nice to just order a pizza for once." He made one last, cutting remark about the pâté, something about it being fussy. Eleanor just watched him, her expression unreadable. He finished the whiskey and stood up, stretching. He seemed suddenly dizzy, blinking hard. "Whoa!" he slurred slightly, gripping the edge of the counter. "Long day. I think I'll go lie down for a bit before I pack." He stumbled out of the kitchen. Eleanor listened to his heavy footsteps on the stairs, then the soft thud of his body collapsing onto their bed. She stood motionless for a full minute, the only sound the gentle tick-tock of the clock in the hall. Then she turned back to her stove. She deglazed the pan with a splash of red wine, the sharp, acidic scent cutting through the air. She worked methodically, her focus absolute. She added vegetables, aromatics, and the rich, dark stock she had prepared days earlier. She transferred the entire contents to a large Dutch oven and placed it in the oven, setting the temperature to low. A very, very slow braise. That was the secret to breaking down even the toughest, most stubborn cuts of meat. Later that night, Eleanor went to work. She was not a hysterical wife, nor a woman scorned. She was a craftsman. She was an artist. And she had just been presented with a new, very challenging ingredient. She brought her tools from the kitchen to the master bedroom. The boning knives, the cleaver, the small, precise handsaw. The next morning, Arthur Vance was gone. The bed was neatly made. The house was silent, save for the faint, delicious aroma of a rich stew, slow cooking in the oven. The first 24 hours after Arthur's disappearance were a masterclass in controlled grief. Eleanor waited until precisely 9 a.m. the following day, the time Arthur would have been settled at his desk, to make the first call. Her voice, when she spoke to Janice, his long-suffering and impeccably organized secretary, was a carefully calibrated blend of confusion and burgeoning worry. "Janice, it's Eleanor Vance," she began, her tone hushed. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but has Arthur arrived yet? He left very early this morning, before I was awake, and he didn't say where he was going. He's not answering his cell phone." Janice, a woman who lived by schedules and confirmations, immediately sensed a deviation from the norm. Arthur Vance was a man of rigid routine. "That's very strange, Mrs. Vance. He has a 9:30 board meeting. He's never late. I'll try his mobile right now." A few minutes later, Janice called back, her voice now tight with genuine concern. "It's going straight to voicemail, Mrs. Vance. Is everything all right at home? Did you too?" She trailed off, too professional to pry. No, everything was perfectly normal," Eleanor lied, her voice catching with a manufactured sob. "We had a lovely dinner. He seemed a little tired, that's all." "Oh, God, Janice, what if something's happened?" By noon, with no word from Arthur, Eleanor, at Janice's urging, called the police. 2 detectives arrived at the house on Maple Crest Lane late that afternoon. The senior of the 2 was Frank Miller, a veteran with 25 years on the force. He was a rumpled, weary-looking man with a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. His younger partner, Detective Isabella Rossi, was his opposite in almost every way. She was sharp, energetic, with a gaze that missed nothing and a mind that constantly looked for the patterns that hid beneath the surface of a story. Eleanor greeted them at the door, the very picture of a distraught wife. Her eyes were red-rimmed, a trick learned from dicing a particularly potent onion earlier, and she clutched a silk handkerchief in her trembling hand. She led them into the living room, which was, like the rest of the house, unervingly tidy. "Mrs. Vance, I'm Detective Miller, and this is Detective Rossi," Frank began, his voice a gravelly but gentle rumble. "Can you tell us what happened?" Eleanor recounted her story, the same one she'd given Janice, but now embellished with intimate, heart-wrenching details. She spoke of the dinner they'd shared, the quiet evening, her waking up to an empty bed. She mentioned the stress he'd been under at work, a big merger that was consuming him. She painted a portrait of a loving, if overworked, husband. Miller nodded along, taking notes, asking standard questions. When was the last time she saw him? What was he wearing? Any arguments? Any signs of depression? Rossi, however, remained mostly silent. She didn't watch Eleanor as she spoke. She watched Eleanor's hands. They were restless, twisting the handkerchief. But there was a strange disconnect between that display of anxiety and the absolute stillness of the rest of her body. Rossi also noticed the faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air. It wasn't the cloying sweetness of potpourri or air freshener. It was something savory, something rich and spiced. It smelled like cooking. "Mrs. Vance, has your husband ever disappeared like this before?" Rossi asked, her first question cutting through Miller's procedural inquiries. "Never," Eleanor said, shaking her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Arthur he's a creature of habit. His routine is everything to him." "And what was your routine yesterday?" Rossi pressed. "My routine?" Eleanor seemed momentarily thrown. "The usual. I was home all day, tidying up. I was doing some prep work in the kitchen for the firm's annual luncheon. It's this Friday. I cater it every year." Miller's pen stopped scratching. "The luncheon? You're still planning on doing that?" Eleanor's face crumpled into a mask of noble sorrow. "It's what Arthur would want," she whispered. "That luncheon is his pride and joy. He loved seeing everyone from the office together. I have to, for him, to keep his spirit alive while we pray for his return." Miller looked at her with renewed sympathy. A grieving woman, clinging to routine, trying to honor her missing husband. It made perfect sense. But Rossi felt a small, cold knot tighten in her stomach. The house was too clean. The wife's story was too polished. And the thought of this woman, in the midst of her husband's terrifying disappearance, spending the next few days meticulously preparing a feast for 100 people felt dissonant, wrong. After the detectives left, assuring her they would put out a bolo on Arthur's car and start checking his credit card activity, Eleanor's performance ended. The tears dried instantly. The trembling stopped. She walked back to her sanctuary, the kitchen, and tied on a crisp, clean apron. She had a lot of work to do. The days leading up to the luncheon were a blur of frenetic, focused activity. Eleanor's home became a commercial-grade kitchen. Huge stainless steel pots and pans, usually stored in the basement, now covered every available surface. She had rented extra refrigeration units, which now hummed ominously in the garage. The grocery deliveries were staggering. Crates of onions, mountains of carrots, bags of exotic spices, gallons of red wine and cream, and the meat. The local butcher, Mr. Henderson, was stunned by the size of her order. "Good heavens, Eleanor," he'd said, his white apron already stained from the morning's work. "You catering for an army?" "Something like that," she had replied with a serene smile. "It's for Arthur's company luncheon. I'm doing my special pulled pork this year. A new recipe. It requires a lot of raw material." She had ordered an unusual amount of pork shoulder and Boston butt, but also several large, unlabeled cuts she'd insisted on, paying in cash and telling him they were for a specialty dish. She also purchased a new piece of equipment, a heavy-duty, commercial-grade meat grinder. It was a gleaming chrome beast with a powerful motor, and she'd had to special order it. Detective Rossi couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Arthur Vance's car had been found abandoned in a long-term parking garage at the airport, but there was no record of him buying a ticket or passing through security. His credit cards were untouched. His phone was powered off, its last ping coming from the Vance home on Tuesday night. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the face of the earth. The official police theory was leaning toward a voluntary disappearance. A man under pressure, running away from his life, maybe with a secret lover. They'd discovered the existence of Tiffany, the young associate, who tearfully admitted to the affair, claiming Arthur was going to leave his wife for her. It was a classic textbook scenario. Miller was ready to scale back the investigation, but Rossi kept circling back to the wife, to the house that smelled of bleach and braised meat, to the impossible calm of a woman who should be falling apart but was instead embarking on the most ambitious catering project of her life. On a hunch, Rossi drove by Maple Crest Lane on Thursday night, the evening before the luncheon. The house was blazing with lights, every window lit up. The kitchen window, which faced the side yard, was steamy. Rossi parked down the street and watched. She could see Eleanor's silhouette moving back and forth, a tireless engine of culinary production. At one point, Eleanor carried something heavy from the basement, and Rossi could hear, even from her car, the low, powerful hum of machinery. It sounded like a motor, grinding away relentlessly in the dead of night. The day of the luncheon was bright and unseasonably warm. The event was held in a rented event space near Arthur's firm. When his colleagues began to arrive, the mood was somber and uncertain. They spoke in hushed tones, shaking their heads over Arthur's shocking disappearance. But then, the aroma from the buffet tables began to work its magic. It was a staggering, beautiful spread. There were artisanal cheeses, delicate salads, fresh-baked bread, and an array of sophisticated side dishes. But the centerpiece, the star of the show, was a collection of massive, steaming chafing dishes containing Eleanor's main courses. There was a rich beef bourguignon, a creamy chicken fricassee, and the dish that everyone was drawn to by its intoxicating aroma, the celebration pulled pork. It was dark, rich, and fragrant with a complex blend of spices that no one could quite identify. The texture was impossibly tender, falling apart at the touch of a fork. Eleanor herself stood by the buffet, dressed in an elegant black dress, her face a perfect mask of gracious sorrow. She served the guests herself, smiling gently, accepting their condolences and their compliments in equal measure. "Eleanor, this is a triumph," said Greg, one of Arthur's partners, his mouth full of the pork. "What on earth is in this? I've never tasted anything like it." Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, her eyes glistening. "It's an old family recipe," she said softly. "A labor of love. I wanted to make something truly special to honor Arthur. He loved this dish so much." She encouraged everyone to have more. "Please, eat up. There's so much. I wouldn't want any of it to go to waste." Detective Rossi arrived uninvited, standing at the back of the room. She watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of horror. She saw the colleagues, the friends, the partners, all lining up to be served by the smiling, grieving wife. She saw them heap their plates with the dark, succulent meat. She saw them eating, laughing, momentarily forgetting the man whose absence was the reason for the gathering. They were consuming his tribute, devouring his legacy. Rossi's eyes met Eleanor's from across the room. For a fleeting second, the mask of the gracious hostess slipped. Eleanor held Rossi's gaze, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of warmth or welcome. It was a smile of triumph, of secret knowledge, of an artist admiring her finished work. In that moment, Rossi knew. She didn't know how, but she knew. The cold knot in her stomach turned to ice. Arthur Vance wasn't missing. He was right here. He was the main course. The luncheon was a resounding success. By the end of it, the chafing dish that had held the celebration pulled pork was scraped clean. Arthur's colleagues left with full stomachs, patting Eleanor's shoulder and telling her how strong she was, how proud Arthur would have been. They were oblivious, satiated, and complicit. For Detective Isabella Rossi, however, the event was not an ending but the beginning of a sickening certainty. The triumphant, chilling smile Eleanor had given her was a silent confession, a gauntlet thrown down. That evening, Rossi bypassed her partner. Frank Miller was a good cop, but his thinking was linear, grounded in the probable. He had already mentally filed the Arthur Vance case under voluntary flight, probable adultery. Rossi knew that what she was about to propose would sound insane, like something from a deranged horror film. She went directly to her captain, a man who, beneath a gruff exterior, respected Rossi's often unconventional intuition. She laid it out for him. The wife's unnerving calm, the obsessive cleaning, the bizarrely timed and overly ambitious catering gig, the new meat grinder, and the smile. You think she killed him, chopped him up, and served him to his co-workers? Captain Davies asked, his pen hovering over a stack of paperwork as he stared at her. His expression caught between disbelief and morbid fascination. I know it sounds impossible, Captain, Rossi said, her voice low and urgent. But every instinct I have is screaming that the answer is in that house, specifically in that kitchen. The timeline fits. He disappears Tuesday night. She spends the next 2 days in what she describes as a cooking frenzy. We need a warrant, a full forensic workup of that kitchen and the basement. Perhaps it was the conviction in her voice or the sheer audacity of the theory, but Davies agreed. He signed off on the warrant, assigning a full forensic team. The official reason was to conduct a more thorough search for evidence related to a missing person, but both he and Rossi knew what they were really looking for. The next morning, a Saturday, the serene quiet of Maple Crest Lane was shattered by the arrival of 3 police cruisers and a forensic crime scene unit van. Eleanor answered the door, wrapped in a silk robe, a coffee cup in her hand. She looked surprised, but not panicked. When Rossi presented her with the search warrant, she simply nodded, her expression one of weary resignation. Detectives, I've told you everything I know, she said, her voice soft. But if you think this will help find Arthur, then please do what you must. She sat in the living room, a silent, graceful observer, as the forensic team, dressed in white Tyvek suits, descended upon her home. The initial search was frustrating. The house was, as Rossi had noted, almost supernaturally clean. The kitchen, the epicenter of Rossi's theory, was gleaming. The stainless steel surfaces had been polished to a mirror shine. The marble countertops were sterile and cool to the touch. The whole room smelled faintly of bleach and lemon oil. It's like a surgical theater in here, one of the forensic techs muttered to Rossi. If anything happened here, she scrubbed it from existence. They used luminol. In the pristine kitchen, under the eerie blue-black light, the story began to change. Tiny, almost invisible specks and faint smears began to glow with a ghostly luminescence on the floor, especially around the heavy-duty drain in the center of the kitchen. More glowing traces appeared on the butcher block island and, horrifyingly, inside the drum of the new meat grinder, which had been meticulously cleaned but not perfectly. Bleach could wash away blood, but it couldn't erase its chemical ghost. While one team documented the kitchen, another went to the basement. It was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. Against one wall was a large, new-looking chest freezer. It was humming quietly. One of the officers opened it. It was empty and smelled overwhelmingly of bleach, so much so that it made their eyes water. But a closer inspection of the rubber seal around the lid revealed a tiny, dark reddish-brown fleck. It was collected and bagged as evidence. The biggest breakthrough, however, came from the most mundane of places. A forensic plumber was tasked with dismantling the P-trap, the curved piece of pipe under the industrial-sized kitchen sink. It was a long shot, but it was designed to catch dense objects before they entered the main sewer line. He unscrewed the fittings and carefully emptied the contessa disgusting sludge of water and old food particles into a fine mesh sieve. He rinsed the contents gently with water. Amidst the coffee grounds and tiny bits of vegetable matter, something small and white gleamed under his flashlight. It was hard, irregularly shaped. It wasn't a piece of bone. It looked almost like a piece of ceramic. "Detective Rossi," he called out. "You're going to want to see this." Rossi came over and peered into the sieve. The tech picked the fragment out with a pair of tweezers. It was a shard, no bigger than a fingernail, of what looked like porcelain. But it had a unique curvature and a metallic glint along one edge. "What is it?" Rossi asked. "I'm not sure," the tech replied. "But it doesn't look like it came from a plate." The shard and the fleck from the freezer were rushed to the state crime lab. The preliminary results from the luminol test came back first. The traces were positive for human blood. The DNA was still being processed. The definitive answer came a few hours later from the lab's forensic odontologist. The white shard was a piece of a porcelain fused to metal dental crown. Using Arthur Vance's dental records, which they had acquired that morning, they made a positive match. The shard came from his upper right molar, tooth number 3. Rossi now had him. Arthur Vance had not walked out of his house. He had been washed down the sink. They brought Eleanor into the station. The interrogation room was a stark, gray box, a world away from her elegant, curated home. She sat opposite Rossi and Miller, her hands resting calmly on the metal table. Miller began laying out the evidence in his methodical, plodding way. The discovery of the affair, the abandoned car, the blood evidence in the kitchen. Eleanor listened impassively, her expression unchanged. "We know you weren't honest with us, Mrs. Vance," Miller concluded. "We know you and Arthur had a fight that night. Marriage is full of disagreements, Detective," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk. "It hardly constitutes a motive for murder." It was Rossi's turn. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Eleanor's. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke softly, conversationally. "I was at the luncheon, Eleanor," Rossi said. "I saw you. You looked so proud. An artist admiring her work." The pork was a big hit. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Eleanor's face. A flash of pride. "It's a new recipe," she said. "The secret is a very long, very slow cooking time. It breaks down all the connective tissue, makes it incredibly tender. And the spices," Rossi continued, her voice dropping lower. "So complex. It must have been difficult to get the balance just right. To mask any unwanted flavors." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "I've always had a sensitive palate, Detective." Rossi slid a small plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside was the white shard. "This was found in the plumbing under your sink," she said. "It's a piece of Arthur's tooth. A crown from his upper right molar, to be precise. The rest of him may have been ground up, cooked, and eaten by his friends, but he left this behind. You're a meticulous woman, Eleanor. It must kill you that you missed a piece. The dam broke, but there was no flood of tears, no torrent of remorse. There was only a cold, chilling calm." Eleanor looked at the piece of tooth, then back at Rossi. Her serene mask dissolved, replaced by an expression of utter, placid superiority. Her confession was not a confession. It was a lecture, a culinary master explaining her magnum opus. She described the argument, Arthur's final, contemptuous dismissal of her life's work. She explained how she had drugged his whiskey and his pâté with a powerful sedative she had hoarded for years. She recounted, with terrifyingly detached, clinical detail, how she had used her butchering tools, the skills he had mocked, to systematically dismember his body on plastic sheeting in her pristine kitchen. "He always said I belonged in the kitchen," she said, her voice even almost conversational. "He saw me as a domestic appliance. I thought it was only fitting that my purpose, my art, should be his final resting place. He called my passion a morbid hobby. He had no idea." She described the grinding, the long marination to tenderize and flavor the meat, the slow, patient braising, the way she rendered the fat to cook the vegetables, ensuring nothing went to waste. It was, in her mind, the ultimate act of recycling, of transformation. She had taken the source of all her pain and misery and transformed him into a celebrated, delicious meal. "He spent our entire marriage consuming my life, my time, my energy," she concluded, a look of serene finality in her eyes. "So I simply returned the favor. Poetic justice, don't you think, detective? He became my greatest dish. And the best part," she leaned forward, a conspiratorial whisper in her voice, "is that they all loved it. They stood in line for seconds. His partners, his rivals, even his little girlfriend, Tiffany, was there. They all said how delicious he was." The room was silent, save for the hum of the ventilation. Miller looked pale, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water. Rossi just stared, mesmerized and repulsed. She was looking at a monster, but one who didn't see her own monstrosity. She saw a chef who had finally created her masterpiece. The story became a media sensation, a gruesome legend of suburban horror. The press dubbed her the cannibal of Maple Crest. During the trial, Arthur's colleagues had to testify, their faces a mixture of horror and shame as they recounted their enjoyment of the luncheon. Many required therapy. The firm went bankrupt within a year. The house on Maple Crest Lane was never sold. It remains empty, a dark monument to a flawless life and a gruesome feast. Eleanor Vance was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She never showed a flicker of remorse. She works in the prison kitchen where, it is said, she makes the best pot roast the inmates have ever tasted.